In the interest of time, we will get started. I'm sure we'll have people join us throughout this introduction, but good evening, everybody. My name is Isis Williams. I am the president of the board of the Haddon Township Equity Initiative, or HTEI. We are so happy for you guys to join us tonight. This is our second community conversation in our Data, Dialogue, and Drinks on My series that came about in response to the Inquirer article by Melanie Burney of the Philadelphia Inquirer on the disproportionate suspensions of Black and Brown youth in South Jersey. Today's discussion is being recorded, number one, so you likely heard that notification. But we are pleased to have with us, I'm very excited to have Dr. Shelley Zion, who will be walking us through today's conversation. Dr. Zion is a professor of urban education in the Department of Educational Leadership, Administration, and Research at Rowan University, where she teaches in the PhD and EDD programs, mentors doctoral students, and leads 3 research labs: the Transformative Student Voice Research Lab, which supports educators to center student voice in their schools and communities; the Partnerships for Educational Equity and Research, or PEER Lab, which uses a research practice partnership model to work with school districts to address equity issues in their systems; and the Critical Consciousness and Transformational Learning Research Lab, which is engaged in longitudinal study of education leaders and their evolution as justice-oriented educators. In these roles, Dr. Zion leads training, research, and community partnerships focused on issues of access, success, and equity. Her work seeks to understand how institutions, social systems, and individual experiences create and sustain systems of power and privilege that ensure access for some while excluding others. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Zion.
Thank you, and glad to see everybody. Would love to see more bodies. If you want to turn your videos on, that always is nice to feel like you're not just speaking to a group of Black squares, but if you are obviously in the middle of dinner prep or something else, that's understandable. We are, as Isis said, recording this, so that's another piece of that. You'll want to make sure that you're okay with being on video in that way. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to have a little bit of time where I do some background work, and then we're going to have a little bit of time where you all get to talk to each other, and then we're going to take questions and see if we can get to making a little bit more sense of the issues at hand. This is a general outline of the way I anticipate the session going. We're going to do some introductions using the chat, so get your chat fingers ready. We'll talk a little bit about ready agreements, which are the agreements we make with ourselves as we engage in hard conversations. Then we're going to talk about the root causes of disproportionality, the way that manifests, and how solutions, kind of come to happen. Then it'll be time for you all to ask questions. So, you might want to take some notes. There's a handout that is in the chat for you that is really just like the handout version of the PowerPoint, so that you can see that, especially when you go into the chat or into the group breakouts. But this is your first instruction, is to go into the chat real quick and introduce yourself so that we kind of know a little bit about who you are and why you're here. So think about, dropping in your name, like your connection to Haddon Township, to HTEI, what's your role, how long have you been here, you got kids here, you teach here, you community member, whatever your connection is. And what is it that brings you to this particular conversation, right? This conversation about disproportionality and discipline. So I'm going to take just a second and let everybody start typing things in so we have a sense of who is in the room. Should have prizes, Isis, next time for the first person to drop a comment or something.
Never too late.
Right? Like, I hadn't even thought about that until just now. I was like, oh yeah, prizes.
Brian used to put music. What happened to the music, Brian?
Oh, music. Oh, look at, well, he busy being the first one to get in there. All right. Well, kindergarten child. Okay. Parent of a 9th grade daughter, XBOE member. Okay. All right. Parent equity group. A little bit of things going on. All right. Board of Ed member, parent, director of student life at Cristo Rey Philadelphia High School. Okay. Okay. Cool. I know where that's at. I live in Philly, actually. Isis, of course. Katie Wolford, incoming kindergarten parent. Yay. Collingswood resident. Okay. Cool. And LCSW Haddon. All right. That's awesome. Student Eastern High School. Okay. Audubon and expat. Okay. Teacher. Okay. Oh, another teacher at Cristo Rey. Okay, cool. I'm in Villanova. All right. Beautiful, beautiful. Haddon Township class of 2003. Awesome sauce. All right. If you haven't got yours in there, go ahead and continue to do that. Oh, living in the district mentioned in the article. Kingsway. Absolutely. Okay. And work for TFA. That's awesome. I thought you might have looked familiar to me, Taylor. I don't know if you were there when in Kingsway we did a conversation like this back in 2021 with some students. Yeah, maybe. No? Okay. All right. Never know. I was always connections that there could be here. All right. Collingswood, Mount Laurel, Haddon Township. Lots of getting around there. Okay. While people continue to do that, I'm going to go to my next slide, which is also an interactive activity for you all. There will be in the chat in just a second. The ready agreements. You can click on that if you want. That like lets you kind of look a little bit deeper into the definitions for each of the agreements. But I just wanted to start with these. I always start any session with these, with the idea being that as we come into spaces where we're going to have conversations with each other about things that might have some kind of emotional or personal or historic or systemic or just complicated feelings and experiences that are attached to them, right? We need to have some agreements that we hold ourselves accountable to. So it's not about policing others as much as it's about holding ourselves accountable to agreements for how we approach those conversations. So you see on the, I guess it's the right-hand side there, the list of agreements. And the question I want you to reflect on for a minute is just which one of these agreements is most important for you when you enter into conversations about race, equity, diversity, inclusion, etc. You know, like what's important to you? What makes it be a space that allows you to feel brave and safe and willing to share and explore and understand and grapple with differences and that kind of thing? And which agreement is the most challenging for you, right? Like we all have the one where like, I got to work on that, right? So I'm asking you to think about both of those things. What's most important to you? What's most challenging for you? And yes, Olga, I will explain the real quick here. So staying engaged, that's fairly self-explanatory, right? Like we're not playing Angry Birds on our phone. We're focused in on what we're doing. Speak your truth. That's your own story, your own understanding of things, not speaking for other people. Experiencing discomfort, right? With growth, with new knowledge, with exposure to experiences that are different than yours, there's going to be some discomfort. Be okay with that, right? You got to lean into the discomfort a little bit. Give and get grace. That's give grace to other people. Give some to yourself, right? These are conversations where the terrain is always kind of shifting. You might say the wrong thing, but don't be afraid to speak because you'll say the wrong thing, right? Don't judge people too harshly if they say the wrong thing because they may not know yet, right? So it's about holding that space for ourselves and for other people to be in a learning kind of space. The 24 to 48 hour rule has kind of two different meanings. One of them is to pause, right? Like if something doesn't sit right, maybe you pause and wait a day or two to come back to it, to really process, to think about how you want to handle it instead of just, reacting in the moment. But the other side of that is an obligation to following up on things that are problematic, right? If somebody says something that lands wrong and you don't ever follow up with them, they walk off thinking that what they said was fine, right? So it's a both and, right? It's like a maybe hold space for yourself to like have a minute and process and figure out how you want to react or respond or engage, but also commit to following up so that you do, kind of close that loop, deal with the issue that came up. Accepting a lack of closure, that is all about the reality that we spent 400 years getting to this point in this country. We're not going to fix it by this conversation tonight, right? We're not going to fix it by one program at our schools next week. It's going to take time. We're not going to just check things off and get them done, and you have to be kind of okay with the fact that it's a process. Noticing patterns of participation, I think, is particularly important as you get into those small group conversations. Who's speaking, who's not speaking? Is anybody taking up too much of the airspace? Are you taking up too much of the airspace, right? Should we invite somebody to speak who hasn't yet? That kind of space. Respecting confidentiality is about taking what you learned away, but not taking other people's stories. People might share something that's a personal thing or that makes them feel vulnerable. That needs to stay in the space where it was shared. Although the learning that you had can come away and be shared. The recognizing intent versus impact, there's again kind of two parts to this. And that's really paying attention and centering the impact. If I do something that hurts you, I need to focus on repairing that hurt versus centering myself by focusing on, ooh, I didn't mean to, right? Like I hurt you, that's a fact, let me fix that, rather than putting all the energy on what I meant to have happen or what I didn't mean to do, right? Considering power dynamics, that's again kind of just read the room. What is your positioning in the room? Whether that's by age or race or gender or sexuality or class or position, in an organization, but knowing that your position and the power that comes with that influences how much voice you have and how much space you need to be intentional about making for other people. And then recognizing the danger of the single story is both, you don't want to be judged by one little story out of your life, and you don't want to make judgments about other people from one little story out of theirs. We all are way more complex than we can ever convey in one little conversation or one piece of information that we share. And we also don't want to extrapolate what we know about a person to other people who we think are part of that same group, subset, whatever, right? So it's all of those things. Hopefully that has helped you kind of settle in on what's most important for you and what is most challenging for you. And we will move from there into our next conversation, but the next conversation is going to be a breakout room conversation. So hopefully this will be helpful to you in that space. The way I want to get started is to have you all generate some ideas. So we're going to create breakout rooms. You're going to have 7 minutes in the breakout room. Your task in the breakout room is to have a conversation. We know that disproportionality is the problem that we're here to talk about. But when we talk about the problem, there are symptoms of a problem. There are root causes of a problem, right? And if you're going to really take on and fix something, you've got to get to the root. So the symptoms are usually those things that you can see that are visible. The roots are the things you have to dig around a little bit more to uncover. And I want you to have that 7-minute conversation in your group about what do you think are the symptoms and the root causes of the challenge of disproportionality. And make sure that somebody in your group is volunteering to be the person who, when you come out of the group, will put your list into the chat, right? So we'll be able to share kind of what all those conversations are. So it's a breakout room. It's 7 minutes. It's pick somebody to be the person who will keep track of your final list of symptoms and root causes, and you're having conversations right now about the root causes and symptoms, okay? You got 7 minutes, and I don't know when that'll start, but it should pop up as an invitation to join. Well, welcome back, everyone. I am hoping that, as instructed, somebody in your group took notes about the things that you identified as symptoms and root causes and can take a moment to drop those in the chat. In the meantime, I'm going to do the little piece of this presentation that is more content-oriented. So we'll be moving through those. You have the handouts if you want to follow along on that. But the first thing I wanted to do was start out with just defining disproportionality, right? And you'll note that I like visuals as a way to mark things more so than just words. So you see the images here that kind of capture, I think, the key points. Is that disproportionality happens in a lot of places. It happens in the classroom, in terms of special programs, like whether people are equally represented in things like honors and AP versus general or remedial kind of courses. It happens in terms of the discipline and who's sent to the principal's office. It happens in terms of grades and other markers of achievement. It happens in referral and identification and placement in special education. It happens in college and career pathways, right? And basically, it's a fairly simple numerical calculation that says what is the percentage of a particular group of people in the total population, and thus what is their percentage in the area that you're looking at, right? And in a simple set of math, you would say that if all things are equal, if I'm 10% of the general population, I should also be 10% of the graduating folks, or the people getting disciplined, or the folks with A's, or the folks, in honors classes, right? That's a little bit of an oversimplification. And that's why I have the last bullet on there, which says the numerical part of disproportionality is not a perfect measure for equity, justice, fairness at all. But it is a red flag, because if you don't have proportionality, you at least know that you need to look and find out the why, right? It might be a perfectly good why, but it's something to look at, right? To start to understand. Too often, what happens with disproportionality is that it's persistent over time, and we can always predict who is more likely to be in trouble, who is more likely to fail, who is more likely to be in the advanced classes, right? Based on demographic characteristics. And that's the thing we're trying to get away from, is where your demographic representation predicts your life outcomes. It is complicated by intersectional identities and what is often not reported, even as we're doing things like looking at the disproportionality data that was reported in the article that brought us here tonight, is looking at the intersection that, yes, it's about race, but it's also about race with gender, but it's also about race with gender, with social class, with special education status, right? And all of those nuances, the more complex you can be in your look, the more likely you are to figure out where the kind of root of that problem is coming from. So that is disproportionality, happens in lots of places all the time. There are 6 mechanisms I'm going to talk about tonight that influence disproportionality, or the creation of that. You see them there on the screen: cultural conflicts, hypervisibility, harsher consequences or adultification, flawed policies, unmet individual support needs, and resistance to inequality, right? And I'll talk about each one of those for just a moment or two. Cultural conflicts, that's one of the first ones that is probably the easiest for us to spot as outsiders coming in. There's lots of ways that culture shows up in our interactions. First of all, culture is something that we all have, not just something that, those people have. It includes things like the rules for communication, right? Are you supposed to raise your hand, or you just jump in and speak up when you have something that you want to say? It includes rules about how you're supposed to focus your priorities. Is it individual, or is it more about the collective, the group, right? It's misinterpretations. It's the way that you said a thing that you meant this way and I took it that way, right? And that comes from my own background, my histories, my cultural understandings of the world. And it's about autonomy and respect, and kind of the differences in how we see those and interpret those things, right? And if you think that I'm being disrespectful, or if I think that you're not valuing my autonomy, those are places where conflict happens a lot, that then turns into, oftentimes, discipline infractions or problems, right? They have a lot of other more pernicious kind of outcomes, because if you are, think about the little boy who shows up in kindergarten super excited to be there, and his cultural way of communicating is to just jump in and say what you got to say when you got to say it, to be funny, to be the center of attention, to be really fluent with his words and humor, right? But he gets in trouble consistently and persistently for not raising his hand, for joking, for being kind of the class clown, for talking when he's not supposed to be talking, right? What he's learning is that he can't really be successful in this place called school. And so that thing that starts as a small conflict that's a cultural conflict, that's a misunderstanding about communication and how we communicate and what the rules are for that, becomes something that impacts that child long term. Same thing with the individual versus collective culture. If you come from a very individualized kind of space, it's about you and you working hard and you working to get ahead and you working on your own. If you come from a collective space, it's about us, right? And it's about how we are experiencing a thing and it's about how we are working together. And the individual part of it doesn't make as much sense, right? But schools are oriented around a particular way of being that oftentimes creates these cultural conflicts. Teachers, people who are often successful in school, tend to have kind of bought into those and reinforce those and may not be aware of the way that those cultural differences are showing up and creating the tensions that then they're interpreting as disrespect, as discipline problems, as behavior problems, that kind of thing. So cultural conflicts, first and I think really common um, ways that disproportionality shows up. Hypervisibility and invisibility actually are two very important things that are kind of similar and again have that more root cause vibe, right? Like it's something that's underneath. It's not something that's in your face every day, but it creates a way of experiencing um, the process of schooling and then the relationships that you have with your teachers, with your peers, with your principals, whatever. And that informs your behaviors, right? Like how you feel about a place changes how you behave within it. Um, so part of this, the invisibility part, is about lack of representation in the curriculum, particularly. It's about a lack of consideration, about not being heard, about not having your way of being recognized and acknowledged and appreciated and respected. Or it's about negative portrayals, right? Like if the only time you see your people talked about, represented, it's a negative, right? That creates a kind of a psychological space that is not healthy and not likely to produce good outcomes. And then there's the idea of surveillance, which is the hypervisibility, right? So like how can we be both invisible and hypervisible? Well, hypervisibility is about who are we watching? Like we tend to notice particular people, especially if they stand out as different from the majority of the folks in the room. And so that means my attention is more on that person. That means I'm more likely to catch them if they do something that is not right. It means I might be more likely to interpret something that they do as problematic. And the graphic that you see here, the infographic, comes from a study that was done in Yale a little while back, where they showed videos of preschool kids playing to educators. Um, the educators thought that they were supposed to be looking for behavior problems. That's what they were told that they were being studied. But in fact, they were tracking the eye movements of the teachers to see, or the educators to see who they were watching, right? Who they were paying attention to. So their instruction is pay attention to these little four kids who are playing together at this table. Watch out for which one is, having problem behaviors. In reality, none of the kids had any problem behaviors, right? But the eye movements of the teachers tracked to Black boys 42% of the time, to white boys 34% of the time, to white girls 13%, and Black girls 10%. So that's just saying that the setup here is when I say there's going to be a behavior problem, who are you watching for? Well, Black boys and then white boys, right? So if you're looking for a problem, you're much more likely to find a problem, right? And if you're not looking at me because you don't think I'm going to be the problem, I might be able to get away with a whole lot of stuff, right? So that's the idea. Hypervisibility means I feel, and you feel it, right? You know when you're being watched. You know when somebody's kind of out to get you. You kind of that vibe, especially when you get middle school, high school. So hypervisibility and also this invisibility, the being erased and not seen, and then also being kind of hyper focused on. I threw this slide in here because it's a resource and it's in your handout, but I really just think if you want to understand more about some of the complexity of this identity work, these are 4 books that you could start with, right? Because they are people who have been writing since back in the early 1900s about different ways that Blackness in particular is both visible and invisible, right? So Franz Fanon, of course, has written a lot about coloniality. He's a harder, chewier read, so if you're not into that, don't pick that one. Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folks is really important. He starts with the question of how does it feel to be a problem, and he talks a lot about having a double consciousness of who you really are and who people perceive you to be. And I think it's a classic bit of text to understand that experience. Ralph Ellison, of course, who is writing fiction, but powerful fiction, right? About, again, the experience of an unidentified Black man trying to make his way in the world. And then Toni Morrison, and in particular the Bluest Eye, but all of her writing, she talks a lot about visibility and invisibility and being seen and not seen, and what that's like from childhood through adulthood, but through beautiful stories. The third way that disproportionality manifests itself is through the harsher consequences and adultification of Black children. So the data shows us that overall, Black students are more likely to receive longer suspensions. So the same fight that we have, Black kids might get 2 days and the white kid might get 1 day, right?
Dr. Zion.
No. Okay. All right. Harsher consequences and adultification. The images here, I think, kind of are pretty powerful in capturing that, but it's the idea of, first of all, the longer suspensions in a fight. So we know that oftentimes in the data we see that Black boys, in particular Black girls to some degree, do receive harsher consequences, like longer suspensions. They also receive more suspensions and consequences for subjective offenses like disrespect or intimidation, or talking back, those kinds of things, whereas white boys are more likely to get suspended or consequences for things that are tangible. There was a weapon. He was smoking, right? Like something that you can actually see and weigh and measure, not something that is about a personal kind of judgment about how somebody was doing. And then the other part of this is about the assumption of criminality, right? The assumption that he must be up to something or she's just being fast, right? It's a removal of childhood, right? It's a removal of innocence. It's a insistence on seeing Black children as older and more culpable than we would see children of other races. And there are a lot of different bits of evidence for that in lots of different places, both in healthcare, in juvenile justice, and in education. The next influence is the idea of flawed policies and systems. And there are a lot of them, right? And we can start there in that bottom corner with redlining. There were things that have been in place since desegregation that, whether we look at the way boundaries are set, the way that school choice happens, there are large national and local policies that create access for some people and less access for other people. We could look at standardized testing and the way that the standardized testing policies, if we're testing kids that we know are not yet prepared for the grade level that they're in, you're setting them up to fail. You know that they're going to fail. And that's creating a cycle that is basically a form of psychic violence, right? Zero tolerance policies and discipline, we've known for years that those are fundamentally bad. It removes decision making. It removes the opportunity for empathy. It removes educators' ability to understand and to look into context. And so it just creates, it feeds the school to prison pipeline. Things like social promotion or grade retention are also policies that get in the way of us doing really good work that is equitable, that creates the spaces where kids feel like they belong. And a kid who doesn't feel like he belongs is much more likely to be an actual discipline problem, right? So some of the discipline problems are unfair and some of them are real, but they have roots that go deeper than just the behavior that happened on this particular day. We have the achievement or opportunity gap and the reality that if you are in a system where you cannot be successful, that's going to influence how you interact and behave within that. And then just this general notion of the school to prison pipeline and the way that young people are treated in schools accumulates from their kindergarten experiences all the way on up and oftentimes ends up pushing them out and pushing them into that prison pipeline. Another one, though, that's also important to talk about is the unmet individual support needs, right? So behaviors happen for a reason. There are students that we have that have experienced individual and community trauma, right? We have students who have mental health challenges that they're dealing with. We have learning gaps that they're dealing with. We have identity issues. They're trying to figure out who they are and they're trying to save face, right? Or they're just bored out of their gourd. Have you followed a kid around school for a day recently? It's a pretty horrible thing to do. We do it a lot in our work doing observations, and you spend all day on a kid's schedule. Not exciting, right? So really looking at sometimes like what are the actual unmet individual needs of children, and are we doing the things that we need to do in our school systems as educators to create the space that they can actually be successful. And then my last one is resistance. And I think about this as a really important one because resistance to inequality happens in a range of ways, right? One of those ways is that we internalize those harmful messages about ourselves and we live down to the expectations that people have set for us, right? So if you think I'm going to be a troublemaker, I may very well decide that that's exactly, I'm going to give you what you expect. Escapism is one way. And these are all, again, they're protective features. You have to figure out a way to keep yourself psychologically safe, right? So rather than continuing to accept negative messages about yourself, you may choose to just avoid that. Don't show up at those places that are, treating you poorly. It might come out in conformity or overcompensation, right? Assimilation. Those are the people who try like 10 times harder to be half as good. That saying that you've probably heard before. There's rejection by opposition where I'm going to act out. Like, you don't want to be respectful to me, I'm going to show you kind of thing, right? Or rejection via identity development that says the sour grapes, the old fox and the grapes thing. I didn't want that anyways. So maybe you have kids who wanted to be really successful in school, but if they continue to fail at it, they're more likely to finally decide to be like, nope, didn't want it anyways, because again, save that kind of identity, save that ego, save that sense of self. And then resistance in its most productive way happens via organization, right? When we come together as individuals, as communities to learn more about who we are, to develop healthy and positive identities, to push back against systems that are being unfair and unjust. So the resistance piece is really the one truly productive for both the individual and the community in terms of resisting the ways that we are treated. A few other definitions. These are my root causes. I haven't even looked. I didn't peek at what y'all put down as root causes. But individual bias, I think that is probably the one that we can work on maybe the easiest if people are willing to engage, right? It is the hardest if they are not. But it's the idea that we all have bias. Some of us have explicit biases where we're like, yep, I don't like those kind of people and I know it, right? That's a different conversation. Implicit bias is the ones where we're making those really quick decisions about whether somebody fits or not, whether they're good or not, whether we get along or not, whether they're a threat or not. And we're making those in seconds based on all of our prior understandings, experiences, influences, and we're not conscious of it. It's not something where we're sitting down being like, ooh, let me do the math and calculate that out and decide whether that's a threat or a problem. It's a gut level reaction, right? And we're not conscious that we're making those decisions. Systemic racism, which is policies and practices that exist everywhere that have created the settings where there are unfair advantages for some people, disadvantages for other people. And again, we often are not even aware of them until we start to really poke around and uncover kind of the roots of things. We have been in the United States taught, trained, bought into The idea that it is a meritocracy, that you just work hard, like it's all individual effort, right? Pull yourself up. It's life is what you make it. There's a million and one sayings that we have probably grown up with that allow us to kind of turn away from and not notice the way that systemic things actually influence and control people's access to opportunity and supports. And then resistance, which I talked about a second ago, but the idea, situation in which people or organizations fight against something and refuse to accept or be changed by that thing. So that is a pretty heavy dose of content really quickly, but you have it in your handouts. And I wanted you to have that so that we can actually have this conversation, right? And I want you to start in your breakouts. So we're going to go back into breakouts for probably more like 12 to 15 minutes and have the conversation about all the things that I just kind of threw out there, right? Like, what are the things now that you've seen those that you think about as being root causes, as being symptoms of being places that we could intervene? And what are the questions you have, right? And when you come back, we'll take time to actually, take the questions that you have come up with in those group conversations. Back, I'm curious to take whatever questions to hear a little bit about what you were thinking, discussing, etc. So somebody can choose to go first and then you can get us started.
Well, I wrote down the question, so I'll say it.
Okay.
But anyone from my group can chime in, please do. I don't want to occupy too much space. How do you create effective and sustainable systems for teachers, organizations, and individuals to combat systemic racism, given everything that we know? How do you stay in it for the long haul? And combat fatigue and resources and lack of allocation. What is the process to do that? Where do you start?
Well, the places that I've seen do a reasonably good job of that are places that committed from a leadership level on down to centering equity in all of their work. So that became their strategic plan, right? And it became how the question that they asked themselves about everything, right? Like, how does this build the climate that we want to have that centers equity, and the question that they asked about every initiative, about everything, right? So it's that commitment, I think, is the first part of it. The second part, though, is about really including all stakeholders in that conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got to have a space where the board is in that conversation, the admin is in that conversation, the community is in that conversation, the teachers and the staff are in that conversation, and the students are in that conversation, right? In terms of defining what it means to have a climate, a culture, a curriculum, right? That is equitable, that is just. I think oftentimes when I look at all of the processes and practices we try to put in place, we don't think about it like a whole system, right? So you have restorative practices, but restorative practices are what we do to kids. No, restorative needs to be about everybody, right? Like if we're centering relationships, we're going to repair and restore any relationship that's harmed, period, right? If we're focused on socio-emotional learning, well, adults need that too, right? Like it's not just the kids. But we get in this space where we're like, we're going to do this thing to fix the kids. We're going to do that thing to fix the kids. We're going to do this thing to meet and we just don't have a vision, right? So, yeah.
Sharita, I hear you typing in the chat. Do you want to?
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
No,
I
you're
didn't
good.
know that was me.
Welcome it. Not trying to call you out, call you in if you have something to share.
No, thank you, because sometimes my space bar goes back and undo what I just did. So that's exactly. I'm so sorry, guys.
You can ask your question, Sharita, and you can also type it in the chat. if you like.
I see Taylor's raised her
Yeah,
hand.
no, yeah, because somebody wanted to speak, so I'm gonna go ahead and finish typing.
Hi, I have a question, just kind of piggybacking off of that. I'm kind of wondering how you would recommend like approaching a district where maybe like, you know, I'm saying this like it's so hypothetical, but I like know exactly who and where I'm thinking of. But like, how would you go about approaching a district where you know they're in the article, but you don't know where administration stands on how they feel about it? How do you like open up that conversation with people who have power as a community member?
As a community member, just interested community member, or a community member with like kids in the school or something?
Well, I did graduate from the school.
Oh, you talking about Kingsway? All right.
I'm not Kingsway. I'm Moorestown.
Okay. Okay.
So I graduated from there. Yeah.
Okay. I think there are a couple of choices, and it really depends on whether you have a relationship with administration, the board, etc., or not. My first approach always is just one of curiosity, to be like, hey, can we have a conversation? I graduated from here and I've learned this thing about this thing, and I'm curious what y'all thinking about it, right? And see what kind of response you get, right? So that's even when I do my like youth organizing and community activism stuff. It's like, let's start with a curiosity question. I'm going to assume that you care about this, because why wouldn't you, right? And then if you tell me you don't care, or you give me some kind of blow off, or you tell me it's not an issue, now I get to decide what's my next, kind of conversation. That then to me becomes more of like maybe that's something formal, like a written letter to the board, or a statement in the paper, or a group like this, right? To say, no, here is a thing that we need to do something about, right? But if it's just a one person on the outside trying to get something started, I would start with just a curious question. Yeah. I think we do have to be careful. What one of the biggest, I think the biggest impossibility to overcome in these conversations is that people are afraid, right? Nobody wants to be the racist superintendent or the racist principal or the racist this. And so rather than kind of coming into these conversations from a place of openness, a lot of times people close down. They're like, gather the troops around, hide, let's hope it'll pass, and instead of leaning into that conversation. And that's what gets the way. Even the people who really would like to solve it, they don't feel like they can actually honestly speak to it, right? Without being afraid that they're going to be called a problem.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Dr. Zion, I see one in the chat if you want to respond, or if Jesse, you want to get off chat. But what are the best practices for holding colleagues accountable or inviting conversations around problematic disciplinary practices?
Well, there's a lot of context got to come up with that one, right? In a perfect world, you would have relationships with your colleagues, right? And you would be able to be like, so, hey, kind of saw you having this little conflict with Rajan over there, and like, here's how I deal with that, and like, what are you thinking, right? And it would be a conversation, because we are all committed to doing things that are in the best interest of all the kids. In reality, there are probably more colleagues that really aren't trying to hear from you, right? Who really don't want to be critiqued, who don't want to be called out, who don't want to be named. There's a great article, I can find it and send it out via the group if you want. It's about how to call somebody in, though. And I think it's got a set of strategies that I think are important about it. It's really thinking about what your end goal is. If your end goal is to really engage this other person, right? It kind of applies to the question Taylor had too. If your end goal is to engage this other person in the ultimate change of behavior, practice, whatever, to benefit kids, then coming in with a hammer isn't the right way to start, right? You may have to have a hammer eventually, but you don't start that way, right? You start by calling people in. You start by figuring out what's in their interest. You start by building the relationships and the trust where they can hear you, critique what's going on. Because when you think about it, even somebody that you really do like and trust, friend, family, partner, whatever, when they tell you that something that you're doing is a problem, it kind of lands funny, right? And our first reaction is often to get defensive. And that's with people that we know, like, and trust. So if you don't have that kind of relationship built, you're not going to be able to do that. That assumes that you are willing to put in the emotional energy and time to build those kind of relationships with each individual person. You may not be that. You may be the person with tenure who's just like, I'm going to name the problem when I see the problem and let somebody else work on figuring out the relational part, the coaching part, etc. Right? That's a position you could take. We always do need the people who are just going to call things out, but there is also a price for that, right? So on either side of this, there's a price. And whether it's you put your time into building those relationships, that trust, and kind of taking on that burden, or if you're going to take the heat of being the one who's always the raising your hand, calling out the problem, naming the unnameable, right? So it's a lot more about picking who you want to be in the conversation will guide your approach.
And I see some conversation in the chat, Scott, with some of your thoughts. Anything you wanted to add or questions or comments here?
No, I'm just kind of picking up what other people are saying and then throwing a couple of my ideas, my thoughts in there, just sort of my philosophy. And that is, I'm just a big person on, you can give me any data set in the world and I will make it look, I'll make it look however you want me to make it look, right? But behind every one of those data sets is going to be, behind every data point is a student, is a kid, and behind every kid's a story. And I will tell everybody until I hit my grave, until you know those stories, you don't know your data. And if you're in a school district where the people making decisions don't know those stories, you're never going to actually achieve everything you want to achieve in this conversation. Because you have to know the stories. Dr. Zion talked about, sometimes it's trauma, sometimes it's just your culture. Something like you need to get to know those things about your students. Because they just talking to kids and talking to staff members who are close to kids and using the staff members, and I say use in a most positive way, making use of the staff members who are close to kids and can already have relationships with them is critical. And there are just too many places out there that aren't interested in doing that. It's a lot of work. It's hard work, but you got to do it.
Okay. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Oswald actually did this work for a very long time in a local district, and I think built the kind of climate that we would like to see happen in more places. So,
I see your hand raised if you want to go for it.
Sharita, yeah, hand up, or maybe not.
Wait. My computer is lagging. Like as soon as it was fine, but as soon as I unmuted, like wanted to unmute, it started to lag. So I think I have two questions. I try to be brief because I feel like I've been doing this work for a long time. I've been in my district this will be my 7th school year. And I feel like, I've been doing this work for a very long time. Because staff, I'm underrepresented. Students, we have a good, population, but I feel like it's just the same thing year after year. And then it's the bad name. Like I feel like with everything that's going on, that's politically trending, things that's going on with the DEIB. Sometimes I do feel like a token at times, but this is less about me and more about how I serve my students alongside with my colleagues and how we serve our students. but sometimes the work gets hard because a lot of it kind of falls on you, especially when you are quote unquote, I don't even like to use the word minority, but when you are that person of color or that point of contact for people of color, it's hard.
Mhm.
But anyway, my point is, the first slide about cultural conflicts, right? How can I really tell people about what are they supposed to say to students? Like, I guess it's the calling in piece, because we had a situation not that long ago. Unfortunately, the teacher resigned, but I felt as though she should have, because she did not know what she was saying was very hurtful, was very harmful to a student. And she characterized the student as a monkey. And a lot of people don't understand that they were trying to figure out why it was a hib against her, and they couldn't understand why the hib was founded, like why it was founded. She didn't lose her job like other people had lost their job for minor things, but I'm not saying that it was warranted to lose her job, but at the same time it was a lot of backlash from it. And she ended up resigning. But people don't understand that in 2024 you cannot call people of color out of their names. You can't insinuate things like, and then is that conversation of why we're making this about race. So that's my point. That's my question number one. And then number two, well, this is more so a comment, but with the data, that's why I said, Dr. Oswald, can you please explain it to my curriculum director? Because then we have the NJGPA test, which all of our students have to take. And let's talk about our students of color that are A, disabled, B, have IEPs, right? They have 504s, but they are not, quote unquote, according to the state, according to the federal law, they're not ready to graduate and move on from high school. So I sat through that presentation last week. So it's like, how do we really have these conversations with people? Maybe I'm asking the same question before, but with these incidents that do happen right in front of you, like, how do we call them out or call them in real time, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, so this will not continue to, kick up every so often?
That's a lot there. There's quite a few ways to approach this, right? So the longer term thing is you've got to create the space where you've got a crew of people that's thinking the same way, right? So it's like, do you have that? Do you have your team of people who are pushing, right, the system to think about this, who are your backup, right, who are thinking the same way, learning the same things, having the same conversations? That's a longer, like a midterm strategy, right? You've got to have that, so you're not the only one. In terms of the immediate, the call in kind of thing, I saw that Scott did drop that link, I think, into the chat to the little article I was talking about. Also, what used to be Teaching Tolerance, it's now Learning for Justice, I think, has one. If you Google it, I didn't know what to say. They have a whole guide that's about how you personally kind of develop your own strategy for how you check people when they say something offensive, right? It can be about being prepared, right? Like if you know there's certain kinds of things that frequently come up, like maybe people use the word thug too much or whatever, right? Get prepared. Like, what are you going to say? Are you going to cite a statistic? Are you going to throw out a fact? Are you going to ask a question? I personally love the tell me more about that. Do you know what that means? Like, help me understand why you think that. Like, do you know that that's an offensive thing? Like something like that. Like, so you have to have your own strategy that works for you, that's comfortable for you, that is about how you approach that. But it's also why in the beginning we started with the ready agreements. That 24 to 48 hour rule gives you a minute to be like, well, I'm going to go think about how I want to handle this. And then I'm going to come back to my colleague, and maybe I'm going to send him an email and say, can we get coffee? Or maybe I'm going to stop by after, school in their classroom and say, can I have 5 minutes? But it doesn't have to be right away, unless there's something that's like an active harm that's happening. So you can have, like, give yourself permission to take some time to figure out how and what you want to say and how you're going to approach it in a way that allows them to hear it, right? And that's partly about who they are. It's partly about who you are. It's partly about the relationship you have, whether that's something you can come to be like, I overheard this thing, and I don't know if you know, but here's how it made me feel, right? Like, or I didn't know if you knew that other people might take it this kind of way. There's just a lot of ways to do it that aren't you're a bad, evil person, right? And so it's really more about figuring that out for you, for your style, and then, like I said, giving yourself the space to take the space if you need a day or two to figure out how you want to approach it. But the commitment to following up is really the fundamental part of equity, right? It's that commitment to letting people know, because people really, truly often don't know. As silly as that seems when you're, living it, they really don't.
And I will add to that one thing that I've done and that we've worked with school districts, schools to do is not only kind of allow yourself the grace to have that time to figure out how you want to respond. Because if you respond right away, you're going to respond emotionally, right?
Mhm.
And well, sometimes that feels good in the moment. It doesn't usually turn into anything productive. But what I always kind of tell people is that there has to be something, particularly when you're dealing with a student, something happens in a classroom. It's got to be something that happens that acknowledges that there's got to be an event, that something you do, a movement, an action that you take that acknowledges that something just happened. And even though I might not be ready at this moment to deal with it, I do recognize it, right? And that tomorrow or the next day, we're going to come back and talk about it. And I'm talking now about a group. When you're a group of students, when you're talking about adults, I still think it's important that you kind of just leave them with that, you know what, maybe we probably should talk about that, even if it's not right at this moment. Because first thing, which I think is a really good strategy, is it raises their level of concern, right? Now they know something's going on, or that they've done or said something, and that probably reduces the chances they're going to repeat it before you get the chance to talk to them. And then, it also lets them know that you recognize it right away, even if, and it's okay that you don't know how to respond right away, but you're going to take the time to figure that out.
So there's a few resources now in the thread. We have a list of resources that we're going to send to you by email after this. We are about 4 minutes from shutdown time. So I'm going to go through the last couple slides I have, just so that you can see where my head was at, and then we can, I guess, take any further questions. When we talk about solutions, one of the things that I think is important is that there is no magic program, right? No magic wand, no silver bullet, no just do this tomorrow and the whole world gets better, right? So what often happens is people come in and be like, oh, we're going to do PBIS and that's going to fix it, or we're going to do healing center schools and that's going to be the magic sauce, or we're going to do restorative. None of that is going to change anything long term if you don't do some of the deeper work to address that larger vision, that larger commitment, that larger focus, right, on us being, as both adults and students, together, working together, doing, amazing things. So all of these programs can be cool. None of them by themselves do it. It has to be a sustained and systemic commitment to equity work over time by everybody all the time, right? Our way of going about that, transformative student voice, is getting kids involved in the center of it, right? Like, center young people in naming the problems that they see in their schools, in researching those problems, and then in working with adults to solve those problems, right? So that is the one that is probably my number one most favorite choice. Awesome to do work with adults. We do work with adults with leadership teams, with equity councils, curriculum groups, whatever. That's important. But if you can get the adults and the students together in the setting where they are having to engage to do the work, that's what's important, right? So you be intentional about picking the kids who have the most to say about the subjects that you're trying to address. You make time and space for it. You lean into critical conversations about privilege and identity and power and race and systems of oppression. You have students and teachers working together period, right? Where both groups have to learn and change and develop new skills. And when you do that, students become critically conscious, they become leaders, they are able to take action. Teachers learn how to share power and voice with students to participate these kinds of projects, take leadership in their schools, and schools and districts that sustain these systems become more just and more responsive and more equitable and resolve these issues because you've created a relationship and a commitment where young people and adults work together to make school better for everybody, right? My favorite quote right there. You have to have the competence to take part directly and authentically in the design of the systems in which you live and work, right? That's what empowerment is. It's not just having a voice. It's not being able to just speak up. It's about really being part of designing the systems that we're part of. So it's relationships, it's reimagining systems, it's working together. That's where we get to equity work. That's where we really get to make things happen. And that's it. Any final comments, thoughts, questions? I guess they can go in the chat, but I definitely don't want to hold people up, you know.
Thank you, Dr. Zion. On behalf of HCI, I'm sure everyone on the call, we appreciate you leading in this conversation. This is the second in our series. We intend to continue this conversation. We've learned conversations lead to results. So we're going to continue to use the resources at our disposal. We appreciate you and your talent. Brian dropped in the chat Dr. Zion's personal information, how you can contact Dr. Z and Dr. O. Thank you as well. Thank you everybody for joining us. We ask that you continue to do so. We will email to you the links for follow-up. There'll also be a link for any comments, feedback, etc. We appreciate you taking the time to continue to engage with us in this work. And almost on time, so thank you for coming out. And we wish you all a good night, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you all.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you.